name is Rob Pirani. I'm the director of the Harbor and Estuary program here at the Hudson River Foundation. I know we have a number of partners in the audience, but for those who aren't familiar, the foundation and the estuary program really share a mission, which is to bring science and collaboration to the management of the Hudson River estuary. We do that in a variety of ways by supporting science and community engagement, by bringing together partners, in particular around the Harbor and Estuaries program, collaborative program, and through seminars like this one, where we share the latest scientific information about the estuary with the public. So welcome. We're really glad you're here. I'm particularly excited because we're here with our partners at NUIPIC, and I'm going to just turn it over to Richard Freisner from NUIPIC for a quick word of introduction.
Thanks, Rob. You can go to the next slide if you're ready. There, thank you very much. NUIPIC is a regional commission that helps the states in the Northeast preserve and advance water quality. Founded in 1947 through an act of Congress in collaboration with the 6 New England states and New York. Our work falls into 5 pretty broad categories that you can see on your screen. And our mission every day, about 125 people around the region come to work to advance clean water throughout the Northeast in collaboration with and service to our member states. And that's exactly what we did here with this project. So thanks, Rob. And I'm excited to hear from Jessica and Robert too.
Great. Well, thanks, Richard. And really, it's been great working with you. And apologies that Zoe, if you can go back to that first slide. So just a little bit of context for the work that you're going to hear about in a second. One of the, HEP's mission is really to bring the benefits of the Clean Water Act, fishable, swimmable waters, to the estuary, to the people and the wildlife that share our waterways. We know that despite our many challenges, whether it's impervious surface or wastewater treatment systems and the large population we have living in the region, our partners at the utilities, public agencies, and community have worked together to really achieve remarkable results when it comes to clean water. You can see here just sort of that generational legacy of efforts related to dissolved oxygen. There's still a lot more work to do, but we do know and we see every day the benefits that clean water brings to people, whether it's increased recreational opportunity, improved fishery habitat, or other aspects of the estuary. You can learn more about the progress we've made in terms of water quality if you look at our harbor-wide water quality report. And Rosanna, who's the primary author of that report, has just shared that on the chat if you want to go take a look at that or download it for looking at later. So we know that people and wildlife respond to clean water, but can we really put a value on it? Can we translate it to that kind of universal solvent money and to be able to describe what those values are? And so we were, that was a question that I think is often coming up both here at the foundation and with our partners. And so we were really excited when EPA came to us with this opportunity to work with NUIPIC to address this question. Working with that team, we selected Dr. Johnston and ICF to address this issue. And that's really the genesis of the report and the research you're going to hear about today. So I'm going to turn it over to our presenters, and just a quick word of introduction about them is we're going to hear first from we're going to hear, I think, a second from Rob Johnston from Clark University. Oh, thank you, Zoe. We're going to hear first from Jessica Balukas from ICF. Jessica is an economist and environmental scientist with 8 years of experience on these issues and really specializes in conducting benefit cost analyses and has done so around the nation. And then we'll also be hearing from Dr. Rob Johnston, he's a recognized expert. He's a professor of economics at Clark University up in Worcester, Massachusetts. He's editor of the journal Resource and Energy Economics, and like Jessica, has really done this work all over the world and has published over 120 journal articles on the economic dimensions of environmental management. So with that, let me turn it over to Jessica and we'll start the program. A reminder for folks who just joined us that you can turn on the show captions if you want closed captions to accompany the presentation today. Please submit questions as they come to mind by hitting the question and answer button at the bottom, at the tool screen at the bottom. And then we'll be taking, reading those questions off once the seminar concludes. Thanks so much.
All right, thanks everyone. I'm Jessica Balukas, and I will start off the presentation today. So we are presenting work that we completed in collaboration with NUIPIC and the Harbor Estuary Program, which I might call HEP moving forward, to assess the economic value of clean water in the New York, New Jersey Harbor Estuary. Next slide, please. So first, I will introduce the project team and describe the study area, and then I'll turn the presentation over to Rob for an overview of study objectives and concepts relevant to our analysis. Then I'll present study methodology and results, and then I'll pass the presentation back over to Rob to discuss potential future research. Next slide, please. And the next slide. All right, so I am speaking on behalf of ICF today, but there were many other members of the team from ICF, Elena, Alyssa, and Isabel. Rob Johnston, our senior advisor, is also speaking today, but we also collaborated with members of NUIPIC, HEP, and EPA. And in addition to the project team itself, we also had feedback from an advisory board committee throughout the project to get their input on water quality improvement scenarios, decisions and assumptions made for the economic analysis, and presentation of findings. The advisory board included government officials from New York and New Jersey, EPA, and other stakeholders for the Harbor Estuary. Next slide, please. So just before we get into details about the analysis, I wanted to provide just like an overview of the study area, particularly for anyone who's less familiar with the Harbor Estuary. So the map on the slide shows the area that that was involved with our study. The study includes 250 square miles of open water and approximately 1,600 miles of shoreline from the Mario Cuomo Bridge to Sandy Hook, New Jersey. The study area includes the lower reaches of the Hudson, Passaic, Hackensack, and Raritan rivers. That was a really quick introduction, and now I'll pass it off to Rob for study objectives.
Wonderful. Thanks, Jess. So what I want to do before we delve into the details, or before Jess delves into the details, is to just set the table a little bit to talk a bit about what we measured, why we measured it, and how you can think about this in intuitive terms. And the reason that we included these few slides is because the word economics and values and benefits gets thrown around a lot, right? People use it all sorts of different ways and in different contexts. And so often that leads to varying expectations for what people might measure or not measure when you think about economic values. So we thought it would be useful to kind of give a little bit of introduction before we delve right into the numbers. So the goal of the study was to answer the broader question, right? How much do people value water quality improvements in the Harbor Estuary? And one thing I want to emphasize is that word improvements, right? So in the title list, we talk about the value of clean water. And so sometimes people think, oh, well, you're going to measure the entire value of clean water, whatever that is, right? In fact, whenever you're measuring an economic value for anything, be it milk or cars or anything, you always have to quantify the quantity or measure the quantity. Think about what you're measuring a value for. So when we think about water quality, we have to be able to quantify it in terms of a certain change, a certain improvement. And the way we did it here was to look at various scenarios, various possible future scenarios for the Harbor Estuary. For example, in this case, looking at scenarios, one in which the Harbor Estuary was safe for recreation, or able to support healthy aquatic ecosystems. And these are based on outside criteria that we then mapped onto what water quality changes those would imply. And so what we're looking at here is the value of changing from where we are now to these potential future scenarios. And then we're asking, what additional economic benefit would society receive from that improvement in water quality? So that's the goal. One thing just to highlight, right? Sometimes when people think about economic benefits, they think, oh, you did a full benefit cost analysis. We measured the benefit side, right? There's also the cost side, right? So if you're going to make those improvements, well, that might involve any number of costs, for example, to upgrade treatment facilities or to do all sorts of other things. And this study didn't measure the costs, right? Certainly one could do that, right? But this study focuses on the benefit, the value to society of achieving those clean water goals, right? So again, just want to highlight that. Another thing it's useful to mention is that there aren't any prior economic valuation studies conducted specifically for water quality in the harbor estuary. There have been lots of economic valuation studies for water quality, hundreds and hundreds worldwide, many in the US, but none in the harbor estuary. So we know a lot about people's values for water quality, but unfortunately, no one's actually done a study here or for the harbor estuary. And so the goal was to provide insight on what those values might be. Next slide, please. Okay, so just a background on a few relevant concepts. And again, this is just to kind of set the table. So when we think about economic value or economic benefits, those are really the same thing. There are really two bins into which that falls. There's market value, and that's what most people think about when they think about economic value. And there's non-market value, right? Total value is just those two things together, right? So market value, that's just the value for things that you can buy directly in a market, right? So you want a car, you go out into the market and you buy the car. The amount that you pay for that car tells us something about your economic value. You're willing to pay a certain amount for it because you value it. You have a certain value for that car. That's a market value. You can buy that car directly and your market transactions reveal the value you have. We can see that, we can count it, not too difficult. Non-market value is the other part of value, and often it's much larger than market value, but it's harder to measure. So non-market value is a value for anything you can't simply go and buy. And clean water is one of those things, right? No matter how much people benefit from clean water because they recreate in it, because it makes them healthier, because it boosts their property values if they live near that, all sorts of ways that people benefit from clean water, but typically they get those services free, right? You can't simply go to the store and buy clean water in the harbor estuary, right? So we can't see those direct market transactions. Those are all non-market values. And so there are a whole bunch of ways that we can measure those, a whole bunch of tools that economists use to figure out what those are, right? Some of them you can see where people go to recreate, how far they go, how to travel to recreate in areas where water's cleaner. You can see where people choose to buy houses, compared to water quality. There are certain types of systematic surveys that can be used to evaluate similar trade-offs. And we put all those things together to give us a sense for what non-market values are. And so what we're going to be doing here is providing a measure of total economic value as realized by the people who live in areas surrounding the harbor estuary. Last thing I want to mention, because this is sometimes something that some people get confused about, is economic value or benefit versus economic activity. And what do we mean by economic activity? That's things like jobs and income. And a lot of the stuff you hear talked about in the media, right? That's economic activity. It's related to economic value, but it's not the same, right? So what we're doing is measuring economic value the same exact way that, for example, when EPA wants to measure the economic benefits of water quality regulations under the Clean Water Act, that's what they measure. And so that's what we're going to be doing here. You could do a separate study to measure, for example, predicted effects on jobs or income. And that's a perfectly valid thing to measure, but it's different from economic benefits. So I just want to highlight that up front, because sometimes when people see economics, they assume you're going to be on the activity side of the ledger, which actually doesn't tell you anything much about how much people benefit from that change. Few other quick things before we finish up. First, when we're measuring water quality, you might say, well, how do we do that? Well, we do it using something called a water quality index, or WQI. And essentially what that is, and again, this is something we borrow from EPA because it's exactly how they quantify water quality changes when they are conducting economic analysis. And basically what all it is, it's a multimetric index that takes a number of different constituents of water quality, or parameters, things like dissolved oxygen, chlorophyll A, nutrient concentrations, all those together, and it puts it together in a particular way, a particular index, which is measured on a 100-point scale, right? And the way that scale is calibrated, it's so as you move higher on the scale, water becomes more suitable for human activities like boating, swimming, drinking up at the very top, and also more suitable for supporting aquatic life. So it basically takes all the different ways that water quality can change and places it into a single consistent index. So you are comparing apples and apples, not apples to oranges. Willingness to pay, that's the way we're quantifying value, right? And again, as I mentioned briefly before, when we think about the economic value of something, the way economists think about it is it's just what someone would be willing to give up to get it, right? If I want to know how much you value a car, the way I measure it is I want to know what's the most you'd be willing to pay to get that car, right? Is it $20,000, right? That tells me that trade-off you're willing to make tells me how much you value it. That's the standard measure of value. So whenever you see an economic benefit cost study, chances are you're seeing a measure of willingness to pay on the benefit side. And so that's what we're doing. I just want to mention that because sometimes people see willingness to pay and they're like, geez, what is that? That seems like jargon. I don't know what that is. That's all it is. It's just the way economists measure value or benefits. And then finally, the thing, Jess is going to be talking about the market extent a few times. And again, that's kind of a technical jargony term, but all it means is whose values are we measuring? Economic values are always received by people. Without people, there are no economic benefits, right? So whenever we're thinking about measuring, or whenever we measure economic benefits, we always have to ask, whose benefits count? Whose benefits are we measuring? And that has to be decided up front, all right? Typically, you would measure, for example, if you're looking at water quality, you might measure the benefits received by people, say, in the surrounding counties, or maybe in the surrounding states. Or you could measure benefits to everyone who lives in the US. Generally, as that market extent gets larger, the value each household receives goes down because the households on average get further and further away. For example, as you move from the surrounding towns to the counties to the state, average people get further away. The value that each household receives goes down because they're further away from the water quality changes on average. But total willingness to pay, or total values aggregated over all households, go up because you're adding over more households, right? So because values depend critically on that market extent, whose values you are measuring, what we do in this study is we actually measure values for two different market extents. So you can see how those values change when the market extent changes. And again, that's not something that there's a right answer for. It just depends on whose values you care about, right? And so that's the way we did it here. Next slide, please. Okay, really quickly, you might say, well, why are you focusing on households, right? Some people think, well, when I think about economics, I think about companies, right? I think about Apple and Google and things like that. Turns out that if you're looking at the value of water quality improvements, we know from decades of work in doing these benefit cost analyses that the vast majority of economic benefits are actually realized by households, by individual households. And most of these are non-market benefits due to effects on recreation, health, quality of life, property values. People's housing values tend to go up if they're in areas with cleaner water. Aesthetics, right? All sorts of ways that people benefit from those ecosystem services that clean water provides, but they can't buy in markets. So by measuring the total value that households receive, both market and non-market values, that's it. That's capturing the vast majority of values. There are also going to be benefits realized. For example, some firms' profits will go up a little bit. That's one way of quantifying another part of economic value. for water quality changes, in most cases, those benefits are quite small compared to household benefits. And so that's why we focus on household benefits here. Concept, you could do a separate study to measure those commercial benefits. We're using an approach here, the same approach used by US EPA, and you notice that we mirror US EPA's approach in a lot of cases here, because essentially we're simply doing what they do, right? So when US EPA wants to do a regulatory impact review and measure the benefits and costs of a water quality improvement, they follow a strict set of guidelines on how to do it to provide valid measures, and that's exactly what we do here, right? So it gives us a little bit of validity, and also saying that we do this exactly the same way that the federal government does it when they're measuring benefits. And what we're using here is an approach called benefit transfer. Right? If we were to go out and do separate non-market benefit studies for recreation, health, property value, we could do that, and it would take us 5 or 10 years and countless amounts of money, because in each case, those studies take a long time. They take a lot of person power, right? So what we're doing is we're taking advantage of the many, many studies that have already been done in the US on water quality value, and we're effectively synthesizing that information into something called a meta-analysis, right? This is something we actually borrow from medicine, right? So when you see something in the news about how a certain drug is going to have a certain effect on people, in most cases, that's drawn from a meta-analysis, where you look at many, many different studies and you take essentially a big statistical model and you combine all those studies into one function that allows you to predict the effect. That's what we're doing here. We're taking observations from almost 200 different studies that have been done on water quality value all over the US, including in New England and in the Mid-Atlantic. And we're synthesizing those to enable us to predict what values would occur in the harbor estuary. And again, that enables us to measure these benefits in a valid way, in a way that it's also feasible within a context of a study you can complete within a year or two, rather than taking 5 or 10 years and countless person hours to do that. So again, that's the approach. Jess is going to be talking about the specific model we use. But again, if there are any questions about that, we can always talk about getting into the nitty-gritty details afterwards. Next slide. And I think that's where I stopped. Yep, Jess. So I'm going to turn it back over to you.
Helps if I unmute. Thanks, Rob. Next slide, please. All right, so this slide contains a diagram that we put together to summarize the methods that we used in this study. We'll cover the methodology in more detail on subsequent slides, but this diagram provides a nice overview. So the water quality improvement scenarios considered in our analysis are initiated by actions to improve water quality, such as the implementation of conservation and restoration practices. Those actions reduce pollutant loadings for targeted water quality parameters. The water quality improvement scenarios for our analysis, as we will discuss in more detail later, focused on reducing pathogens, nitrogen, and phosphorus, and increasing dissolved oxygen. So these water quality improvements result in improved environmental conditions, including improved water clarity, reductions in harmful algal blooms, and improved aquatic communities. Our analysis translates these environmental improvements into a water quality index, as Rob introduced earlier, the term water quality index. And this water quality index value can be used to indicate whether water quality is suitable for various human uses, such as boating, fishing, swimming, or drinking. The water quality index is then used as an input into a valuation function to estimate the value of improved ecosystem services or benefits provided by those water resources. Our analysis relies on a benefit transfer approach, as Rob introduced earlier, to estimate the per household dollar value, also known as the willingness to pay, a term that Rob also introduced, associated with those water quality improvements in the harbor estuary. The per household willingness to pay values are then aggregated across all affected households. The estimated economic values account for improved value of water-based recreation, improves aesthetics for near water recreation, reduced human health effects associated with recreational activities, among other ecosystem services. So now going into more detail about some of those methods. Yes, thank you. Next slide then. So to estimate the economic value of clean water and associated ecosystems in the harbor estuary, we used a benefit transfer approach that allows us to leverage existing valuation studies. So we used a benefit valuation function based on a synthesis of 59 peer-reviewed high-quality studies of water quality improvements across the United States. The function is tailorable to water quality improvement scenarios in the harbor estuary by using local data on water quality, characteristics of the study area, and populations and demographics data. So using a benefit transfer approach is cost and time effective for estimating reliable economic values. And Rob mentioned several times, we're using the same approach that US EPA uses to estimate benefits for regulatory analysis under the Clean Water Act. Next slide, please. So the value of water quality improvements to households estimated in the study implicitly include values for numerous underlying ecosystem services that would be affected by water quality improvements, including everything listed in the purple box on this slide. Improved recreation, improved fishing experience, aesthetics for recreation, healthy aquatic species, and healthy ecosystems. These values include both use and non-use values for water quality improvements and capture the majority of economic benefits due to water quality improvements. Note that the methodology estimated total value of water quality improvements to households and not separate values for each category. So we estimate a total value to a household, but we can't separate, well, $5 of that is attributable to improved recreation and $2 is for increased property value. It's just an aggregated value. Other methods can be used to estimate separate values for each category, but the resulting values would not account for all the benefit categories included that we get from this methodology. Next slide, please. So the estimated values include the majority of economic benefits, as we discussed in the last slide. But just to reiterate, and Robert introduced this as well, the estimated benefits do not include benefits to commercial entities, such as additional profits that might be realized by businesses that rent recreational equipment, changes in ecosystem services that are unrelated to water quality improvements. For instance, in order to improve water quality, sometimes you'll do like wetland restoration, and those wetlands can provide additional services such as, flood retention or flood prevention that we're not valuing. We're focusing on the water quality improvement portion. We're also not valuing economic impacts such as like jobs or effects on the local economy. We're focusing on the value to households. And as we mentioned earlier, there are available tools and methodologies to calculate these benefits that we're not considering in this analysis, but they weren't the focus of this particular study. And since methodologies do exist to estimate these benefits, they could be the focus of future work. And we will cover potential future research in more detail later in the presentation. Next slide, please. So this slide describes the 4 water quality improvement scenarios involved in our analysis in more detail. Through consultations with NUIPIC, HEP, EPA, and the advisory board, we settled on the following water quality improvement scenarios. These scenarios rely on a definition of clean water that focuses on improvements to 4 water quality parameters: enterococcus, total nitrogen, total phosphorus, and dissolved oxygen. We know that current work to limit CSOs is intended to achieve the Clean Water Act's goal to make waters safe for fishing and swimming. As a result, the first 2 scenarios focus on achieving water quality suitable for primary contact recreation, or water safe for swimming, and secondary contact recreation, or water safe for paddling, boating, and wading. The 2 more illustrative scenarios, or scenarios not tied to known improvements at this time, are to improve aquatic life in the harbor estuary through DO improvements and improvements in total nitrogen and total phosphorus. And then lastly, we did a combined scenario. So basically, improving for aquatic life, and then also the more stringent of the two, recreation, which would be primary contact or safer swimming. Next slide, please. So after finalizing the water quality improvement scenarios, we translated baseline and scenario water quality into a standardized measure that can be readily linked to measurable economic benefits. Again, that water quality index that we mentioned earlier. So the water quality index translates multiple parameters that measure various aspects of water quality into a single numerical indicator and links specific constituent levels as reflected in individual index parameters for total phosphorus, dissolved oxygen, the other parameters that we considered, to the health and aquatic species and suitability for recreational uses. The water quality index used in this analysis, again, is the same one used by EPA for their benefit cost analyses. Next slide, please. So after estimating water quality index values under the baseline and for each water quality improvement scenario, we used a benefit transfer approach to estimate the economic value of water quality improvements. The benefit transfer methodology synthesizes information from dozens of prior studies of water quality values conducted across the United States. Using the information extracted from these studies, we estimate a meta-regression model or evaluation function used to estimate willingness to pay for water quality improvements. So first, we use the meta-regression model to estimate willingness to pay per unit of water quality improvement. And that's a way that we can more easily compare across studies when we focus on the per unit water quality improvement. Then we estimate total per household willingness to pay by multiplying the willingness to pay per unit water quality improvement by the total water quality index change under each scenario. And lastly, we aggregate per household willingness to pay over all households within the specified market extent to estimate total population level value. We'll discuss that market extent more on the next slide. But benefit transfer using a meta-regression model is generally considered to be the most rigorous and accurate method of benefit transfer. And so this slide shows the market extents that we use for our analysis. And again, Rob introduced market extents earlier to give you a preview. But this is basically the market extent that we selected, or the location of households likely to hold values for improving water quality in the harbor estuary. We used households within the 30 counties corresponding to the scope of the harbor estuary program. And those are the 30 counties showed on the map on the slide. The market extent includes approximately 8.5 million households. Next slide, please. So before we move on to the results, I want to quickly summarize the methodology covered on all the prior slides into a few basic steps. So first, we synthesized data from existing studies and estimated a meta-regression model, or the value estimation function that we use in the analysis. The meta-regression model is grounded in models used previously by EPA. Then we assessed current water quality and projected changes under each scenario and linked these water quality values to a water quality index. We collected household and other data for the extent of the market, including geospatial information, and combined these data with the meta-regression model value function to estimate willingness to pay for each household. And lastly, we aggregated values over households and time using appropriate discount rates. Next slide, please. And one more. Thank you. So before we get into results, I just wanted to note some of the resources available related to this study. We developed several products to describe the study and its findings, as well as place the results into context. So several of these products, including the full report, are available on the HEP website. And additional resources, such as a media kit with talking points for the study, are available upon request. If you are interested in the media kit, please contact Rosanna. And I think she'll put her email address in the chat. Next slide, please. All right, so this slide shows both the estimated annual values for each household for the 4 water quality improvement scenarios, as well as total annualized values. So the total household willingness to pay values range from approximately $33 for making the water in the harbor estuary safe for paddling, boating, and wading, or secondary contact recreation, to $301 for the combined scenario, or making the water safe for swimming, paddling, boating, wading, and able to support healthy aquatic ecosystems, that combined scenario I mentioned earlier. So household values represent average values to households across the market extent for the water quality improvement scenarios. Some households may value water quality improvements more, and some may less. It's an average value. And so then we aggregate those household willingness to pay values over the entire market extent to get, and over time, we used a 20-year analysis period to get total annualized values. The annualized values enable comparison of values over any time period. Annualized values range from 156 million for making the water in the harbor estuary safe for paddling, boating, and wading, and 1.4 billion for that combined scenario. So these estimated values can be used by policymakers to contextualize efforts to improve water quality in the harbor estuary. The Harbor Estuary Program and NUIPIC have already published these values in press releases about this study. And as was mentioned on the prior slide, we created several resources to help distribute the findings of this research and provide additional context. Next slide, please. And so this slide places those results from our study into context among other studies that have valued water quality improvements. I think when you initially look at those results, your first thought might be, wow, those look quite large, particularly for that combined scenario. But one way to put the values into context is to compare the estimated values per unit of water quality change to similar values from the literature. In other words, we divide the estimated household willingness to pay by the estimated water quality index change and compare those values to values from the literature. This figure shows how our estimated values compare to similar values from primary evaluation studies. The literature values are for estuary-based studies along the East Coast of the United States. As you can see, our estimated values fall in the middle of average values from the literature, which tells us that our estimates are reasonable. Now I'll pass it off to Rob for a discussion of potential future research.
Perfect. Yeah, next slide, please. So, again, we've said this before, but prior to the study, there have been no economic valuation studies for the harbor estuary. So this is the first attempt to measure those values. And as we mentioned before, the study focuses on the dominant component of water quality value, but it doesn't measure all possible values in all possible ways, right? So one of the things one of the questions we sometimes get is, we'll do what part of this is recreation? What part of this is health? What part of this is property value? And with the current data, we can't parse those, right? And as Jess mentioned, one of the reasons why we don't try to measure each of those individually is what that gives you is a little bit of a dartboard, right? You get this value and that value and that value. But it turns out that you actually can't simply add those up because they overlap, right? And so generally the best way to measure values is the way that we've done it here, which is to measure one composite value for households, and that prevents the dartboard problem. But it doesn't mean that you couldn't in the future go forward and collect primary data and focus on specific types of values for which you might want more information. For example, they did that. In fact, I was actually involved in this study back in the 90s where we did that for the Peconic estuary system. It was a multiple year study, and we did individual studies to look at recreational values, and we looked at effects on property values. And so you can certainly do that. That study was different many years ago, focused on different water quality improvement scenarios. But the point is that there's no one single way that you can approach the economic value problem. You're basically looking at the same thing from different angles. So this is the beginning. This is the first time anyone's attempted to measure these values. It's not necessarily the end. There are lots of different ways you could go into the future and different aspects of value that one could measure. Next slide, please. So some of those things you might or could be measured, right? If one wanted to do that, right? So one thing that you could do is to look at or estimate values for specific ecosystem service benefits beyond water quality improvements for the same conservation activities, right? So for example, one of the ways that people might seek to improve water quality would be to increase wetland area, to restore wetlands, to develop new wetlands. Those wetlands will not only produce water quality benefits, but they will almost certainly produce other benefits as well. You know, they provide habitat. They, in some cases, might provide separate recreational benefits, separate from the water quality benefits. And those values can be measured, just as we did here. You can measure either total benefits or individual benefits, say recreation or habitat or what have you. That's one thing you could do. Similarly, another approach that is used to enhance water quality is to place riparian buffers, right? To restore riparian buffers, to restrict development close to water bodies. You can also restore estuarine habitat, right? Again, those are sorts of things that enhance water quality, but provide a range of other economic benefits that again, you could measure. So those are what we call co-benefits, right? They're separate from water quality change, but they come from the same action, right? So if you restore wetlands, they're going to have a range of different benefits, including water quality. So along the way to generating the types of water quality benefits we're talking about, there's probably also going to be co-benefits that are generated. And if one wanted to do a full cost-benefit analysis, you would certainly want to measure those co-benefits. Okay, so back on to water quality improvements. You could also then ask, well, what about values for specific uses or ecosystem services, right? So for example, you might say, great, I'm glad I know the total value of these water quality improvements. But what I really care about is I want to know the predicted change in housing values in a particular town or a particular municipality within a certain distance of the water, because that's what I really care about. Maybe I live there. Or I really want to measure the benefits that are due to recreation alone, right? Everything else aside. You can do that, right? Again, that would require a different kind of data, right? You could do it using benefit transfer from existing studies, as we've done for total benefits, or you could go out and, even better if possible, and actually calculate that, you know, for things that you can observe now, like property values, you can go out and you can gather or purchase that data, and you can do that analysis. It's an entirely different study, but it's all doable, right? So those are sorts of things that one can certainly do in the future, right? And again, there are many different ways that people benefit water or benefit from water quality changes that are all wrapped up in the total numbers that Jess talked about. One could start to measure individual parts of that using separate studies. And again, there's a long history of studies that do that. It's just a matter of you know, gathering the necessary data, doing the modeling. It takes time and money, but it's all doable. Again, you could think about human health benefits as part of that, right? So one of the key benefits of water quality, depending on what kind of waters you're looking at, are human health benefits, for example, due to contact recreation or other ways that humans, again, make contact with water. Or, cleaning up water often leads to reduced pollutant exposure from various ways due to fish consumption, right? All sorts of ways. And you can measure those benefits. There are established ways to do that. When you're thinking about recreational users, again, I already mentioned recreational user values, but if on the economic impact side, you might want to know, well, how much more are tourists going to spend in the area? Again, that's an economic activity measure, not a benefit measure. But again, you could certainly do that, right? A lot of people, they might not care so much about the total economic benefits. What they really want to know is how much more people are going to spend at local hotels and restaurants and what have you. Those are economic impact studies. They're entirely different, but they're equally valid for what they measure. And again, that's something that that could be done as a totally separate study, right? And then, as we've mentioned a few times, if you really care about particular industries or commercial firms, you really want to know what the benefits are going to be, say, to firms that support recreation or tourism or what have you. Again, you can certainly measure that. to be clear, those benefits are going to be a much smaller slice compared to the benefits we've measured here. But again, there are established methods to do that, and you can certainly measure those. Next slide. And I think that's it. So unless somebody else is going to say, now you can ask questions. I suppose if you have questions, I believe you're supposed to enter them in the chat. Or Rob, maybe I'll hand it off to you, and you can launch it from here.
Thanks, Rob, and thanks, Jessica, for obviously for all your work along with your colleagues, and for that great presentation. Let me. I'm seeing some questions starting to populate in the chat. So why don't I take the first one, and then I'll ask one as well. But this comes from Dave Anning. Are there estimated values per unit water quality improvement? Are the estimated values per unit water quality improvement based on the same parts of the index, the same marginal change? That is, people would be likely to see water be more willing to pay if there were improvements, let's say from 60 to 70 than from 90 to 100.
That's a good question, and one that we've definitely received before. And there's actually two different variables in our equation that account for like those water quality index values. So in addition to using the change, we also use a ratio of the baseline value and the scenario value, like basically the average value between those two. And water quality is considered a it's basically like when you're moving from 60 to 70, economists anticipate the value being higher for that change versus when you get higher on the scale. It's a like the law of diminishing returns, and I don't think I'm explaining it well, but feel free to jump in, Rob.
Yeah. Basically, the function does exactly that, right? So that as you get more and more of something, it's valued somewhat less. And so if you were to actually graph this, what you'd see, if you can see, Mike, is a nice, is a nice little kind of log-shaped curve. And so there's two things, and this just mentioned, as you start off at a higher baseline, the values for sequential changes go down. And as the changes get larger and larger, the value for that last unit of water quality improvement goes down. So that's exactly what the function does. And that's why it's for the intuit, and because we see over and over and over again, and it makes sense that as water gets cleaner and cleaner and cleaner and supports more and more and more uses, making it even cleaner gets a little less valuable. Doesn't mean it has zero value. It's just that value goes down. And so that's exactly what the function in the meta-analysis captures.
Yeah, exactly. 60 to 70, you're getting to improving recreational values, and when you're already at 90, that water's very good, and so people are usually less willing to pay for waters that are already great to make them even better. Rather focus on the ones that need a little bit more help. Yeah.
Thanks, guys, for that explanation. Maybe let me just add a supplement to that question. Perhaps you can discuss, I know we spent a lot of time as you guys were taking on the study talking about the current water quality in different water quality regions within the estuary. And maybe you could just discuss how that played into the calculations of willingness to pay, the difference in terms of how much water quality would have to be improved in, let's say, the lower bay to get to swimming versus in other parts of the harbor.
So for this analysis, we took an overall average of all the different water bodies. We did calculate separate water quality index values for each individual water. And then when applying it into the valuation function, we took an overall average of the harbor estuary, kind of treating it as one unit rather than all those individual water bodies. Right. Is that what you're asking?
Yeah, exactly.
And one could do it different ways, but the approach used there basically assumes that that people in the region don't just care about the water that's closest to them, right? Essentially what it says is that people care about the entire harbor estuary. So that's the assumption underlying that approach. But the approach certainly does capture the fact that in each scenario, water quality would change by different amounts in different areas, right? The other thing, and if I can just jump in because it's related, one of the questions that is also related was something that I guess Jim Lodge asked and said, can you elaborate on how willingness to pay changes with distance from the water body? Or with the methodology used in this study, is distance from the water body not important? And that's also related to essentially spatial dimensions. And the meta-analysis does accommodate that, right? So, for example, if you use the meta-analysis to predict values further and further away from the watershed or from the improved water, those values will go down, right? And that there's a specific distance variable built into that meta-analysis that explicitly captures the fact that values tend to go down as you move further away, right? So that if we, if we were to predict further and further away over larger and larger extents of the market, what you're going to see is those predicted values per household are going to go down as you move further away. But then as you capture more and more and more people, the total values tend to go up because often the number of households you're adding offsets the distance effect. But again, that can vary depending on where people live in the affected area. So the model definitely does capture those sorts of spatial effects.
Yeah, we didn't go into detail about specific variables, but there are definitely geospatial variables that account for distance.
And to be fair, some of I believe the specifics of the model are in the report. And so you can see all that, including all the individual variables. And of course, if there are any questions about, when we're done here, people, I'm sure that people could contact me and just say, hey, I'm curious about that particular thing. And I'm always happy to answer. So.
Right, thanks. Here's a related question from Nancy Fish, which is, does your study break down the value by county?
We did not present the results by county. We presented it just for the full market extent values that we used. And at one point, Rob had mentioned that we had considered 2 different market extents. So we only discussed one today, the 30 counties that encompass the HEP region. So in the report, we present values for both the county market extent, and we also extended it to the entire states of New York and New Jersey. So you could kind of see how that decision affected the total estimates, but we didn't present county by county. It was just the total market extent for both. We could present by county, but we didn't in the report.
And I guess just a follow-up question on that. So if somebody was interested in terms of that for a particular county, would the results be valid? In other words, could you say this is how much it's worth to the residents of, Bergen County, or is that not an appropriate way to use the data?
I think it would be fine. We don't typically report results at like that small a scale, but we would be able to produce them if there was interest.
Yeah. Well, one thing I should just mention is that because this is based on a data synthesis, it becomes more accurate as you predict over larger areas, right? And so there are caveats, right? As you predict over smaller and smaller, imagine an extreme case where I predict the value for Rob Pirani, right? Well, that's probably going to be pretty inaccurate because there's a lot of idiosyncratic things about individual, right? And so you need to predict over a certain minimum size for the law of averages to kick in and be able to say, okay, on average, this is going to be really close to the true value. And so that's one of the reasons that we tend to predict over larger areas, because we know that those predictions are going to be much more accurate and valid than if we go smaller. But again, you could certainly do this for a county. You would get a good measure, and then it would just be a matter of kind of making everyone aware of the caveats that as you get smaller, the values tend to, on average, might be a little less accurate.
So I think that's great. And I guess just kind of thinking ahead to maybe a question I'll ask at the end, in terms of the many stakeholders we have in the audience and how they might use this, it seems to me what you're saying is, using it for the region, good. Using it for an individual county, well, you might want to caveat that, using it for, let's say, a sub-region, maybe that would still be okay. Something like that. Is that a fair way of characterizing?
Yeah, I think that's really fair. And the only sorts of applications where I would personally, again, this would get a little bit nervous is when you get really down to local areas, right? Because again, this study isn't designed to capture, for example, the localized effect of one person or one group neighborhood that's right on the right against the water, right? Though that sort of situation has a lot of unique characteristics that aren't going to be captured by kind of the larger scale average, what these sorts of meta-analyses are really good at. And so so I always just like to caution people that as you get smaller, right, you kind of caveat emptor, buyer beware, right? And again, there's no point at which we say nope, can't use it, right? It's just the smaller you go, the more those localized things become more important, that it's difficult to capture in these larger scale models.
Sense. So here's a couple of questions from Rick Ball over at Region 2 at EPA. Thanks you for the presentation. And I will say, once again, thank EPA for supporting this study. Rick asks, can you explain why the value of secondary contact recreation is not contained within the value of primary recreation? And, maybe more explicitly, that within the study, the household value of secondary recreation is valued at $30 per household per year. And so if you could just talk about how you arrived at that.
Sure. So it was different valuation scenarios. And so secondary contact recreation was one of the scenarios that required the least change in order to meet, like the least water quality change to meet. Primary contact recreation, like meeting primary contact recreation standards, would incorporate secondary recreation. So, like once you meet secondary recreation, then you have to get up to primary contact recreation. Like it's just a higher level of water quality. So we had two different scenarios. One to show like what improvements would be needed to get to secondary contact recreation and what would be the value of that. And then another scenario that like took it to the next level so that you could swim in the waters. So secondary contact recreation is encompassed in primary contact recreation, but we wanted to provide values for both. So you could get a sense of the value for reaching those two different targets.
Yeah. So if you were to just subtract those two numbers, basically that's the added value of achieving primary contact levels of water quality over and above the value of achieving secondary contact levels of water quality value.
Thanks. So here's a question, and I apologize because I'm probably going to mangle this person's name, but I think from Taisa Kulik. Was the economic impact of remediating sediments considered as a factor in the study? Were sediments a part of any of the 4 scenarios for water quality you utilized, or did any of the studies that you used for your meta-analysis relate to the economic impact of remediating sediments to water quality?
So none of our 4 scenarios focused on sediment or like TSS, total suspended solids. That's just not a factor that we chose to focus on in these water quality improvement scenarios. There are definitely studies in the underlying metadata that, considered water clarity or other parameters that would be indicative of solids like you're mentioning. It just wasn't the focus of our particular scenarios. Again, we developed those scenarios in collaboration with NUIPIC and HEP, and like we decided to focus on like recreational uses and also improving aquatic life. And so TSS just wasn't a particular focus of our decisions, but it's definitely something you could focus on, and it's a metric in the water quality index that we use. For our particular scenarios, we held it constant because it wasn't an area of focus. But if we wanted to do additional scenarios where that was a focus, we could use these methods to estimate that.
And answer the question. Some of the studies in the meta-analysis are relevant to TSS. So the model does have the capacity to do that.
Yeah, and just to add on to the answer to this question, this is Alyssa, someone else who worked on the analysis alongside with Jess and Rob. Would you mind actually progressing, I think maybe one slide? So this actually provides the threshold values and the data sources for the various scenarios that we had used for this study. And so while I just want to clarify that while sediments could be, part of enjoying water bodies, it could be part of sustaining aquatic environments. We based these scenarios off of federal or state level criteria or threshold values that have been published already and then related back to those various uses. So that just gives a little bit of context, and this information is also available in the report.
Okay, well, thanks, Alyssa, for that clarification. Susie Ross has kind of an observation and a question. So she says, such an interesting study. I understand the complexity, cost, and time to do in-person interviews to perhaps more accurately arrive at valuation. I can't help but wonder how much different these values might be with that approach. So is the EPA approach also using meta-analysis? And was the research conducted peer-reviewed? So I guess, maybe there's 3 questions in there. If you were going to do a deeper dive and do those in-person interviews, would you expect to get it a different number, or and then the other one is, in terms of how EPA approaches this problem and the use of meta-analysis in their other studies?
Yeah, no, those are really good questions. So first, I'll try to answer all of them, and hopefully I'll get them all. So great question. How much different these values might be if you collected primary data? And it turns out that there's a way you can answer that, right? And the way you do it is effectively called cross-validation. And essentially what happens is you take your meta-analysis, which is 59 studies and roughly 170 or 180 different observations of value, right? And what you do one at a time is you pull one of those out of your model. You estimate the model using all what you've got left, and then you predict the actual primary study one that you left out, right? So it's like that. So you're basically doing, and then you do that over and over and over again for every single observation. So you're basically leaving out one at a time each of your primary studies, and those were actually measured using, for example, actual, in-person interviews or whatever it is. There are different ways that those values are measured. And then you see on average how accurate you are. And again, we've done that. And the accuracy, depends a lot on the model, depends a lot on the context, right? But, and again, I'm just thinking off the top of my head. I don't have the numbers in front of you, so please take this with a grain of salt. But but typically, for something like this, if you do that over and over again, you might be off by, I don't know, 30%, something like that, give or take. Again, it depends, and I'd have to go back and look at the studies. But this also relates to the third question, which is, was the research conducted peer-reviewed? And there's 2 answers to that. This individual study is brand new, so it hasn't been peer reviewed. Eventually, we might go out and get it peer reviewed and published. Now, to be fair, it was reviewed by people, at HEP and by others within the advisory committee. So we've had input and peer review in that sense all along the way, right? But it hasn't been double-blind peer reviewed like you would do at a journal, right? So yes and no, depending on what you mean by peer reviewed, right? We've had a lot of review, but not kind of a blind journal peer review. And certainly one would hope to do that in the future. But this meta-analysis, this approach to meta-analysis, the one that we've been using, I've been working with folks at ICF on improving and enhancing this model since about 2001, right? We first published a model of this type in 2003. And so progressive versions of this meta-analysis have been peer-reviewed multiple times. And most recently, a slightly different version of this meta-analysis was just peer-reviewed and accepted for publication about 2 weeks ago, right? But we had a version that was very, very similar to the model we used here. Again, it was peer-reviewed in 2019 and accepted for publication there. So this general approach, using this kind of data, using almost the exact model that you're seeing here, has been peer-reviewed quite a number of times at different journals, and it's published lots of different places. And if people are curious about those articles, again, be happy to share those.
Nice. So here's a question from Syed Nabil. Great presentation. Just a quick question. What were the conditions filter used in selecting studies? Was it based on location? Was it New York City, the East Coast, the Eastern United States?
Yeah, great question. And Jess, I'll jump in, and then you can jump in if you want. So again, these data have been collected. We started first collecting these data in around 2000, and in the report and in the publications that we've made, we describe the exact criteria. And effectively, the way this is done is you go through a systematic review where you search according to a set of criteria. And the key criteria here, I'm just prattling them off the top of my head, and so it's possible I'll miss something, but it had to be a particular type of evaluation technique called a stated preference study that measures total willingness to pay, market and non-market values. It had to be conducted in the US, and it had to be for a water quality improvement that improved recreation or some type of aquatic ecosystem services. We did not include studies that were solely focused on drinking water, because that's a whole different thing. So basically, these were studies that focused on exactly the kind of things we were looking at here. Things like recreation, property values, those are the things that are captured in these overall studies. There's also a time span, a cutoff for the oldest year of the study. I forget exactly what that was. The water quality changes had to be measurable or transformable to that WQI we used, right? So that if the study didn't have a rigorous description of water quality that we could map to that water quality index, it couldn't be included. And then there was kind of a minimal quality screen, right? I mean, it had to use, there were certain approaches. It had to meet certain minimum quality standards. I mean, if you were using just a totally invalid method, then obviously that wouldn't be something we would include. And then as a final note, we included both published and unpublished studies. For example, things like doctoral dissertations. And sometimes people ask about that. Well, gee, why wouldn't you only include published studies? And it turns out that there's a long history of meta-analysis and evidence that suggests that if you do that, you risk something called publication bias. And that is that the peer review process can sometimes focus only on certain types of studies. And so if you only include the peer-reviewed literature, you can actually get a biased perspective on that value. And so what we try to do is cast a wider net and include both published and unpublished studies. So that's just kind of a quick overview. It was not limited to areas just surrounding the harbor estuary. And the reason is, and this is applicable to any sort of meta-analysis, it's that each study, the way we think about it is it gives us a little bit of information that's relevant to the target site. In this case, the target site is the harbor estuary. But so imagine that you have a study that's far away from New York, New Jersey, but there are other things about that situation that are similar to the harbor estuary. For example, maybe the demographics are very similar. Maybe it's a similarly highly densely populated area. Well, that study, when you combine it with other studies, can give us relevant information about the harbor estuary, even though that's not geospatially close, right? And so that's why we don't kind of categorically exclude studies that are far away. Also, if we were to limit it only to studies surrounding the harbor estuary, not only would we get a prediction that's less accurate, but we would also, we'd really reduce the number of observations we had to draw on. So the statistical error would just get huge, right? So instead of errors that might be, 30, 50%, we'd be looking at errors that would be 1,000 or 2,000%. And obviously we don't want something that's that poor, right? So it turns out that when you're doing these meta-analyses, in general, within bounds, more information is usually better. Again, within certain constraints. So hopefully that answered the question.
Thanks, Rob. And I'll just add that, again, we didn't go into specifics about variables included in the model, but we do also have regional variables too, to help capture, that there might be differences in water quality evaluations on the West Coast versus the East Coast. And so that, like the settings in the variable, or the settings in the model runs help account for that.
Yeah, and that's a super important point, Jess, is that if you actually look into the details and the machinery, the models, one of the reasons we use these meta-analyses is there's a whole sequence of variables that allows us to target the value to that site, right? So for example, the income of the households we're talking about, right? The land use surrounding the area, the region of the US where it is, what kind of uses are we talking about, right? And so if we were to use this as we did here to target the harbor estuary versus imagine we were applying it to water quality improvements in Lake Michigan, you would get very, very different values because those contexts are different. And that's why we use these sorts of meta-analyses, because they allow us a much greater ability to adjust those numbers, right? Sometimes you see what we call crude unit value transfers, where they just take one study and they'll just say, oh, it's $10, and they just multiply that by everybody. We don't do that because it's so highly inaccurate. So the advantage of meta-analysis is it allows us to really fine-tune that estimate to the specific characteristics of where we're predicting a value. In this case, the areas surrounding the harbor estuary.
So here's a question from Nancy Fish. I'm going to elaborate on it a little bit. So Nancy asked very specifically, what is in the media kit? Mm-hmm. And just a reminder that if you're interested in any of the great products that ICF and Rob produced, you can go to our website for the report. The link is in the chat. And then if you want the media kit itself, just email Rosanna, and her email is there. But let me elaborate on this question about just what's in the media kit, and ask you guys to maybe offer some examples of, how best to use this information. We have a lot of stakeholders in the audience who think about water quality, think about the benefits that water quality brings to people all the time, help people realize those benefits in a number of different ways. Can you guys pick, maybe not, either one way or your favorite way, or some way that they can use this information at their cocktail party this weekend?
Yeah, I can actually elaborate on what's in the media kit. So it kind of covers a variety of different statements. We tried to separate them based on what they'd be appropriate for. So there's statements appropriate for headlines or pull quotes. An example would be clean water in the harbor estuary supports safe recreation like swimming and paddling and enhances local quality of life. And then there's statements appropriate for communicating the study to the general public. And that would go into a little bit more detail than these like 1 or 2 sentence pull quotes. And then finally, we have statements that are appropriate for communicating the study to policymakers. So where the policymakers might want more details and kind of linking it back to components that would be important to them, we've added that context there. And we've organized it based on main questions that you might have about the study. So things like, what is the goal of the study, or whose values were measured and for what scenarios? And then provided statements at those different levels that I just described. And also included in the media kit are various graphics, some of which you've seen within this presentation. And the graphics are accompanied by figure captions, so it gives you some context for how you might want to use the graphics within any of the materials you're putting together. So that goes into a little bit more detail of what we've provided, but to answer Rob's direct question, I would suggest those statements that are like the pull quotes or headlines for your next dinner party to describe the study.
Thanks, Alyssa, for that answer. I don't know if I can put Rob or Jessica on the spot, and maybe it's not the what's the most surprising thing you learned, or the most the best statement you would think of making based on the work that you guys all did.
So it's an interesting way of putting it in that. So in a sense, surprise, in a sense, I guess I would answer that by saying it's not particularly surprising, right? Well, for a lot of people, right? So for people who don't do this kind of work, I guess the surprise is that maybe that water quality change is worth a whole lot, right? And so even if an individual household, right, benefits by $30 or something like that, right? Not a massive amount. Well, think about all the number of households that water quality touches, right? And that's why non-market values, that's why environmental changes have such immense value to society, right? Because unlike a market good where only one person gets it, right? If I buy a car, it's my car, right? I'm the only person who gets to use it. I'm the only person who benefits. But if we improve water quality in the harbor estuary, everybody potentially benefits. And so those benefits just magnify out, right? So we're not only magnifying by people, right? Everybody in living in that area potentially benefits. Now, maybe they only benefit a little bit, but by the time you count for everybody and then count for all the years that they benefit from that, those values get truly immense, right? And so that, I think, kind of, is it surprising? I'm not sure if it's surprising or not, but it makes some people raise their eyebrows, right? When you really think about how big those values get, right? And they can really swamp the market benefits and other sorts of things. So that's the first thing. And again, as I mentioned before, this isn't every possible value you could measure. It's the lion's share of them, but so just the magnitude and how quickly they can blow up. And it's just simple math, right? It's just the number of people that live around the harbor estuary. There's a lot of people who can benefit from those improvements. In another way, though, not surprising at all, right? As Jess showed by that little graph, these values that we're estimating here are right smack dab in the middle of exactly what you'd expect them to be. And in a sense, that is exactly what you'd want, right? I mean, if we were to do this study and all of a sudden we have values that are way off the chart on the high end or super low, now we have to scratch our heads and go, wait a minute. Something's wrong here, right? Is there a mistake? Is there something really strange? And so the fact that there aren't any surprises is actually really good, right? Because we've measured values over and over and over again in lots and lots of different places, and they're predictable, right? I mean, they move according to what you'd think they should move according to. And so the fact that these values come in right where we think they would as economists is something that is unsurprising in a good way, right? And that they're exactly what you'd expect, right? And so is it surprising or not? I don't know, but I guess the take-home message is that improving water quality is really valuable, right? And we shouldn't forget that. And the other thing, and this is, I guess, the last thing I'll close with for this question, is that values aren't just about market values. That's something that people mistake or always forget, right? They assume that if someone doesn't buy it at a store, that it must not have an economic value. And that's just not true, right? I mean, so clean water, ecosystem services provide benefits to people just like things they buy in a market. But the cool thing is that they provide it free to those people, right? So if water quality improves in the harbor estuary, the people who live in that area can get many of those benefits without paying a thing, right? And that's one of the reasons they're so valuable, right? It's because you don't have to buy it. Again, someone has to pay the money to improve that water quality. So it's not as if improving water quality is free to society as a whole, but for each individual household, healthy ecosystems provide all sorts of, quote, free services. And that's one of the reasons they're so valuable. But people sometimes forget that because, again, we're kind of trained to think about economic values just in terms of what I buy when I go to the store, right? But it's much broader than that. And that's the other thing. Is it a surprise? I'm not sure, but it's really important to realize when we think about what the true economic benefit of improving the environment is.
Thanks, Rob.
Thanks.
We didn't go into detail about the two different market extents. In this analysis, again, we focused on the counties, but I would say one surprise for me in this analysis was that when we accounted for New York and New Jersey as a whole versus the 30 counties, it wasn't as big a difference as I thought it would be. And that's because most of the people in New York and New Jersey live within those 30 counties. So that was the biggest surprise for me. But I agree that overall, the results weren't that surprising.
Yeah, I will observe that I think at HAP and at the foundation, we're always pleased when benefit analyses take into account the number of people who actually benefit here, which isn't always true in some calculations. And, Lisa Rossman from NOAA actually put a question in that kind of relates to this, and just maybe some context for that. Fact about the study, and she asked, what proportion of the studies used in the meta-analysis were from urban areas versus non-urban areas, and how could that have influenced the outcome of your study?
So I can pop in just briefly on that. So the short answer is that I'm just looking at the variables here. That I don't know off the top of my head and again, depends to a certain extent on how you define urban, right? But I don't know to what proportion are in kind of defined urban areas versus non-urban areas. And honestly, some of the studies span urban and non-urban areas. So it's not so easy to simply classify them. In fact, a number of the studies cover, for example, water quality improvements in entire states. Right. So, for example, we have some that the market extent is, for example, much or all of Rhode Island, right? Which covers urban areas and non-urban areas, right? So it's not a super easy question to answer. I think, certainly you could go through, and I don't happen to know this off of my head, and you could say, well, what proportion of the studies overlap at least some of an urban area, right? And there's also another question of there's the area that's improved by the study, and then there's the market extent study, and it's a simple question that has a really complicated answer, right? But I think a slightly maybe more useful answer is that the meta-analysis itself has a number of variables that adjust for the types of differences you would see between urban and non-urban areas, right? So there's a number of land use variables, for example, that cover the type of land area that's within the watershed. What proportion of it is agriculture? I'm not sure if this model does, but I know many versions of our model have a population density variable in it as well. And that's what I was trying to find right here, but I ran out of time, right? So there are a number of variables in the meta-analysis that are explicitly designed not necessarily to capture that threshold, urban, non-urban, because there's nothing about that kind of arbitrary threshold that should influence values, right? What should influence values are the things that determine that urban thing. For example, population density, right? And those are the sorts of things that the model does accommodate. And so the model systematically adjusts for variations that you'd expect to see between urban and rural areas. And so the model does accommodate that, but I don't off the top of my head know what proportion of the studies overlapped in urban area. My guess is that many of them probably do, at least in some way, because most of the studies are over fairly large areas, states, things like that. And so virtually all of them are going to touch on some urban area in some way, but I don't know the exact percentage.
And I think this is our last question, again from Tysa Kulik. And I think you partially answered this, Rob, but what are the biggest differences you determine for the value of water quality changes specific to this estuary as compared to other bodies of water? Oh, I think you're on mute, Rob.
So that's a tougher one to answer. And maybe could we go to the slide that shows the comparison of these values to other places? It's a little sideways bar chart.
I think it's slide 22, if that helps.
Zoe is here and can change. Oh, there we go.
Okay, so we're there. Okay, good. Oh wait, no. There we go. Okay, right. So no, the bar chart. That's exactly where I go. So this kind of shows, and we designed this for for different areas. This is mean per household willingness to pay estimates per unit of water quality change, and that's important, right? In that this isn't the total aggregated value. This says what are the per household values, right, for per unit of water quality change, right? And so you can see how the values in the harbor estuary compare. And again, I mean, you see quite a range of different values. And again, this is per unit, right? And so that's going to be influenced by where you start, for instance. So I think the part of this question, or the implicit part, is why, right? Why might these values be different, right? And so without looking at the specific details of the model, and one could certainly answer that. Well, why would values in the harbor estuary be different from, say, Narragansett Bay or the Chesapeake Bay or the Peconic? Well, a few different things that we'd consider. First, incomes play an important role, right? And so that income variable obviously is going to differ significantly depending on where you're looking at, right? And so that's an important thing. We also find that those land use variables, land use, land cover, the urban versus rural, those matter a lot, right? And so again, that's going to influence those values. And then also the region of the country, right? We find that values tend to be systematically higher and lower in different areas. And so in each case, right, it's all those things together that cause values to go up or down compared to other things, right? And so it's difficult to say why exactly are the harbor estuary values kind of in the middle like that, right? And the real answer is it's a combination of all those things, right? It's the fact that it's a Northeast study with a particular set of incomes for the market extent in the harbor estuary, with a particular set of uses that were affected, with particular land use characterized by a fairly urbanized area, at least for a good portion of it, right? All those things together, put them all together. Some of them make values go up, some of them make values go down, and you mix them all together in the meta-analysis, and that's what you wind up with, right? So it's not any one thing that causes the values to be higher or lower. It's all those things together, right? So, and again, if someone wants to kind of delve into the specifics of the meta-analysis, what you can actually do is pull up the spreadsheet, and it'll show each variable. And it can show essentially the contribution to the total value. And so if you actually want to delve into the nuts and bolts and the machinery, you can actually see which variables have the biggest effect, right? And so that's, if someone really wanted to know those answers, that's where you'd go. You delve right into the data and you'd say, oh, in this case, these are the major things that are driving values, and these are the things that have a small effect. So that's question is definitely answerable, but it's probably not something we want to do on the webinar right here today. But again, if someone really wants to delve into it, that's a question that that could be answered.
Well, listen, let me start the closing by thanking all for you, Rob and Jessica, Alyssa, all your colleagues at ICF for taking on this work and contributing, really, I think, a seminal study to the harbor estuary. let me thank EPA for their support, and of course NUIPIC for being such a great partner in this enterprise. I think we all collectively view this as not obviously the answer is not 1.4 billion. The answer, that's maybe part of the answer, and so we're hopeful that between your work and this work and your work going forward, along with folks in the audience and others, we can start to answer more questions about the value of clean water in the estuary and the estuaries overall.